All right, we've been talking about diagnosis basically. How do we get information? So we have in our previous conversations talked about some examples where I shared with you real world scenarios where we gathered information, and mostly what you saw were times where I conducted interviews, either formal or informal, with customers to try to get information to diagnose the system, to determine what intervention we should come up with, make sure we're on the right path before we go run around and try to change something. We do a diagnosis. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about some other ways to gather data to get useful diagnosis. Now, the diagnosis step in the general model of plan change is the second step, but remember, we can use diagnosis anywhere. If we need it, we'll do more diagnosis. And we also have, at the end, when we have got everything in place in the last phase of the plan model of change, then we go back and we evaluate and institutionalize the change. We'll usually do another level of diagnosis there to make sure that what we've done really accomplished what we think it would do. All right, so now that's the setup. Here we go. So when it comes to data collection, there's a kind of a feedback cycle. So let's say you're working with the client and you go in, you get agreement that we're going to go out and we're going to collect some data by some means or another. So first you plan to collect the data, then you decide which methodology you're going to use. Then you go out there and collect the data, you get that data, then you have to analyze it. And there are different ways to analyze and make sense of the data. Then you have to go back to the boss, to the person who's commissioned you or hired you or asked you for help, the leader, and you have to give them feedback and share what you learned from the data in a meaningful way, and then you got to follow up, right? And of course, follow up may mean more collection of data, or you're ready to move forward with an intervention. Right. So here are some of the main things we use to get data. The first one are questionnaires. The second one are interviews. The third one are observations, and the last one is something we call unobtrusive measures. So when it comes to questionnaires, that's pretty simple. You send out a questionnaire. But it has some advantages, and it has some disadvantages. So some of the major advantages to questionnaires are they're really pretty cheap to do. They don't cost a lot of money. You send them out and you get them back. A couple of the disadvantages is you don't get to look people in the eyes. You don't really get that empathy thing. Sometimes people write something down in a questionnaire and it's cold data. It's not the same as if you were there and say, oh yeah, the person was telling me this, and they were shaking their head no the whole time. It gives you a different level of understanding. And of course, with questionnaires, there's always a possibility of bias. Now, if you'll think back in your career, you've probably had some times where you received a questionnaire from corporate, and you get this thing and it says confidential, and you're thinking, yeah, right, confidential, and you fill it out and you don't really know. Well, they're confidential, but yet you're part of a group and they know you're in the group, and there's just always that little bit of fear. So there's a tendency for there to be some bias in questionnaires sometimes. All right, the second major way to gather data is interviews. Go out and interview people, talk to them, sit down. That's great. One of the advantages is you get that empathy thing going, and sometimes in the course of an interview, it might be a structured interview or a semi-structured interview, but usually you have a little bit of flexibility to ask some follow-on questions, that sort of thing that you can't do with a questionnaire. So this can be another big advantage. It's a very rich source of data, but there are some disadvantages, and one is it's expensive to do. Let's say you work in an organization like Georgia Pacific and you've got 300 facilities in North America all over the place, and you want to get a sample set of interviews for an organizational intervention. Wow, that's expensive. Maybe you can do some of them by phone, but that's also very time consuming. So there are some downsides to interviews. Also, another disadvantage to interviews is that you go and you talk to people and you get all these answers to questions, but it can be difficult to make real sense of all the answers that you got. So coding the information meaningfully can be difficult. And also, there's another downside to interviews, potential problem, is that every interviewer, whether you like it or not, you're human and you have certain biases. And it's hard to keep those out of the interview process. And that's one reason why when we do interviews, we usually try to create a set of questions in advance. And we might vary from them a little, but we make sure we ask those same questions to try to keep our biases out of the interview process. The third major type of data collection is observation. Observation is quite different than interviews. So observation, you go in, you set yourself up, you watch the people at work, you listen, you take furious notes, and you figure out what's going on. In an earlier video, I gave you an example of how I'm working with a senior leader, and we're going to do observation on his direct reports. And his direct reports during their upcoming meeting. And this is a very positive thing. We're looking for areas of strength and areas of opportunity so that we can coach those folks to be more successful, but it's based on observation. Now, some of the major advantages are it's real time. It's not historical, it's not reflective, it's actually happened, it's current, it's the people that are really working on the work right now. And it's also good because you're getting data on actual real world behaviors, not talking about how I might behave, what you might think is going on, or anything subjective. You literally are observing objective interactions. Now, some of the disadvantages are that the observer's going to have a bias, and the observer's actually there, so there's that Hawthorne effect. The observer can cause people to change the behavior. They might have acted differently if you weren't there. You get this information, but how do you make sense of it? So you have that same coding challenge that you have with interviews. And then the last thing is, to do observation can be very expensive. I mean, you may have to go and spend days and days observing people in a work environment, for example. That could be really expensive. There might be, travel involved to get enough meaningful observation time to do a reasonable, get a reasonable amount of data. Okay, so the last area we're going to talk about is something we call unobtrusive measures. Unobtrusive measures means that we're going to gather data from secondary sources. And those secondary sources could be records or any kind of, for example, let's say you're trying to do a change of culture like we are at Georgia Pacific. Well, people leave, they retire, some people exit from the organization, or they might get fired from the organization, just as in any big company. So most companies have a system in place what they call exit interviews. So everybody that leaves the company for good or ill, maybe they got another job somewhere, or maybe they got fired, or maybe they're retiring, whatever. We interview them. So we interview them, and we have data. They tell us why they left. You've heard probably statistics that the number one reason most people leave jobs is surprise, not paycheck. It's I couldn't get along with the boss, for example. So we get all kinds of data like that. We have this data, and so we might in an organization say, I'm going to do some data research on culture. What can I get? One meaningful source might be to go back and mine the exit interviews for the last couple of years. And then from that data, you might be able to make some observations that might lead you to, hey, I'm going to go do some interviews and include some questions that I might not have included had I not done the unobtrusive measures. So some major advantages of the unobtrusive measures is that there's no bias, really. You're just looking through, it's an autopsy. You're looking through data from the past. It's got high validity, and it's really easy to quantify it, So that's an advantage, a couple of advantages. But the problems are, it is historical, can be hard to code, of course, and sometimes it can be difficult to get these data. For example, your company might do exit interviews, but it may have a rule in place saying that no consultants or manager can observe those unless they're actually part of the senior team or HR or whatever. So there can be difficulties getting access to the data. Now, last point, and we'll close this piece out, is that when it comes to gathering and collecting data, we've talked about 4 of the major ways that we go about collecting data. But very often, if it's a major change we're trying to do, we will probably use several different types of data collection to get a full and robust analysis going. And then we have the information we need to make sure we're on track. That's it for now. We'll talk again real soon.